Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life. This podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, my online intuition development program for people who want their self-awareness to serve a greater good. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, and today on the podcast I'm connecting with John Michael Greer. You may remember him from episodes 59 when we talked about ritual and magic, and 44 when we talked about mystery teachings of the living earth. For the better part of the past year, I've been working my way through John's thick tome, The Celtic Golden Dawn, an original and complete curriculum of Druidic study. It's basically a handbook for the solo practitioner of earth-based spirituality who feels an affinity for mystery schools. It's a symbiosis of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn with Druidry. John's actually written over half a dozen books on Druidry and nature-based spirituality alone, just that one category, as well as a whole host of other books on mystery schools with their arcane knowledge and intriguing histories. So if anyone is uniquely qualified to write a handbook of this sort, it's John. So John, tell us, what identities do you lead with?
That's always the kind of question that I have to scratch my head over a little bit. What can I say? I'm a druid. I am a student of esoteric spiritual traditions, have been since my youth. I'm kind of a geek about it. Everyone hears about computer geeks. There are non-computer geeks. I'm one of them. And so that's just key. Think of me as a slightly odd person with a beard who studies strange books and occasionally has, I hope, something worthwhile to say about them.
That is a visually rich description, actually. I'm I think that's helpful for people. So we're talking today about your book, The Celtic Golden Dawn, which I have been working through for several months now. And I wonder if we can start at the very beginning. Can you just give a brief overview of the history of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn?
Sure thing. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was the most influential magical order of modern times. It came into being in 1877, try that again, 1887, get the dates right here, coming right out of the first rush of the beginning of the magical revival in the Western world. Started a couple of decades earlier with Eliphas Levi, the great French occult writer, when he wrote Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic. And so basically you had a bunch of men and women in Britain who were very interested in the magical arts and who organized this group, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, to offer initiation and training. And it was a very elaborate system. Their goal was literally to put together the entire magical tradition of the Western world into a single package. I don't know that anyone could ever succeed in so gargantuan a task, but they gave it a really good shot. And they came up with a system that, for all its limitations, that it has some, it is really the most complete magical education you can get these days, even today. So the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in 1887, really had its stride around 1890, blew sky high in a series of political crises between 1900 and 1903. Everybody who is listening to us knows this story already. The group of really gifted people who lack the talent to really get along, and we've all watched this, okay? And you start getting the quarrels, things spiral out of control. Somebody tries to take charge and run things, and it all goes plooey. That's what happened to the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. There were various splinter groups that went flying off in all directions. Now, one thing that happened during this period of conflict, of argument, of bickering, of nastiness, a lot of people who were members of the Golden Dawn bailed out, of course, the way people do in a situation like that. And it so happened that a bunch of them ended up going to the various British Druid orders that existed at that time, which were going through a very peaceful period in their history. That doesn't always happen. There have been some rough spots in Druidry's history too. But at that time, the British Druid scene was calm. It was quiet. People got along well. And all these basically refugees from the Golden Dawn were going, oh, thank God. So they brought a lot of stuff with them, a lot of the teachings and traditions, and that was kind of where as we'll see as we proceed, that's kind of where this book came from. That interaction between Golden Dawn initiates and people in the British Druid scene in the first half of the 20th century.
Okay, so I'd like to talk about the main differences philosophically and practically between the more Judeo-Christian approach, the Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn, and then the Druidical approach and how you've merged them together. As we're starting that, though, can you just, like, there's certain signs and symbols that are clues if you recognize the Golden Dawn. How would people who've just, this is the first time they've ever heard of this, what are some of the very common signs and symbols that would help them identify, oh, that might be in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn tradition? I have a few in mind, but I'm wondering if you could help people identify.
Okay. The thing that you look for, first of all, is if anybody's tracing a pentagram in the air. Okay, the five-pointed star. Eliphas Levi, who I talked about earlier, the French occultist, introduced that idea as the pentagram as an important magical symbol. The Golden Dawn was the people who created the lesser ritual of the pentagram, which just about everybody does. So now it's been borrowed by everybody and their mother-in-law at this point. But so you look for that. You look for cross and triangle in combination. It's a very common Golden Dawn symbol. You look for, in the Hermetic order, you're going to look for a lot of Hebrew, and you're going to look for a particular form of the Kabbalistic tree of life, which we are going to be talking about a little later. And so those are things that, I mean, there's a lot. The Golden Dawn, the body of material that was published by the Golden Dawn, which I ended up editing, the 7th edition of Rogarty's book, The Golden Dawn, I edited a few years ago. It's an immense body of lore. You can keep yourself busy with that for a decade at least, just to get the basic hang of it. But those are some of the basic symbols. Now, to cycle to your question about the Judeo-Christian and the Druidical understandings of things and how those work out in philosophy and practice, the Judeo-Christian tradition is a pair of Judaism and Christianity, a pair of prophetic religions, by which I mean they had founders. They had, all the religions in the world, very broadly, there's a bunch of overlap, but very broadly, we can sort them out into two classes: prophetic religions and traditional religions. Prophetic religions have founders. Prophetic religions are about saving you from something, whether it's saving you from ignorance, as in Buddhism, or suffering, whether it's saving you from hell, as in Christianity, or what have you. There's always that thing of salvation. There's something wrong with you, and you have to be saved. Not all, most prophetic religions tend to be down on nature. They tend to be, the world is this kind of, the world isn't good enough for us. We should be going to heaven or nirvana or what have you. And so and of course in the Western world, meaning from the Middle East on as far as you care to go, prophetic religions are monotheistic. They're, we've got the only God there is. It almost hostage laws it. We've got the only God there is, and if you want to see him again, you'd better pay your tithes.
You better pray. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Traditional religions are polytheistic. They believe in many divine powers at many levels, from the great powers of the cosmos to nature spirits. Okay. Traditional religions don't have founders. They evolve out of people's experience. Traditional religions tend to have a much more relaxed attitude toward nature. They didn't have a much more relaxed attitude toward sexuality, which of course is one of the most direct ways in which we experience nature. They don't tend to get all bent out of shape about concepts like sin. It's more, how do we establish good relations with the physical and spiritual worlds? And so in talking about taking something that was basically rooted in a Judeo-Christian, a prophetic standpoint, which of course the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was. Its founders were mostly Episcopalians. Most of the people who were involved in the founding of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, they belonged to the Anglican Church, as it is, of course, over in England.
Wow.
And in fact, they made heavy use of Christian symbolism. And taking that and taking the techniques and reworking them for a Druidical standpoint, a standpoint that is more nature-centered, that is not focused on this notion of salvation, of there's something wrong with you, you're full of sin, but just let's establish good relations with the cosmos here. It took a lot of work, but I had the great advantage that a lot of that work had been done by those refugees from the Golden Dawn back in the 1920s and 30s, you see.
Can I ask you about some of those refugees? Is one of
Sure.
them the fellow who, and I'm losing his name. I know you'll know it, but the fellow who went on to found Wicca?
Oh, Gerald Gardner. No, Gardner came in from a slightly different source.
Oh.
But the thing a lot of people miss is that the occult scene, especially back at that time, was a bubbling cauldron of different things. There was all kinds of stuff going on. Gardner was involved in one of the main Druid orders at that time. One of his very close friends was Ross Nichols, who was the founder of the Order of Bards, Ovids, and Druids, and probably the most influential Druid writer of the 20th century. And but he was going in his own direction. He wanted to reinvent a kind of a really robust pagan sexual, sex-centered nature spirituality, and that's where we got traditional Wicca. But yeah, most of the people that were involved in this are not names that anyone has ever heard of. In some cases, I can't even find the names. All we have are scraps of like stuff under pseudonyms. When somebody signs their document Pendragon, that doesn't give you a lot of help for chasing down the biography.
Right. So since there's so few records, then you had to create the Celtic Golden Dawn, this new book, from something. And so there, there's talk. The word Reconstructionist is used sometimes in Gallic polytheism or Celtic polytheism. So this idea of a Reconstructionist approach to paganism seems to be, at least it's on the internet, I think, because we don't know and we can't attribute. So I'm curious, like, how did you decide? I know you've been studying forever, but how much of this is, were you able to recreate, and how much of this is through your own practice? Can you just tell me a bit about how you decided what a druidical curriculum, which is what this book is, how did you decide what it needed to look like?
Okay, well, here again, I had a huge advantage, and this is something you won't hear from the Reconstructionists, because they tend to be kind of edgy about this. There have been people doing Druid stuff for about 300 years now. What we call the Druid Revival got its start in the early 18th century, right around the time the Industrial Revolution was getting going. What happened was you had a lot of people in Britain at that time who were looking at the spiritual options available to them. Here you have dogmatic Christian religion on the one hand. Here you have dogmatic scientific atheism beginning to take shape on the other hand. And both of them saying, we're the only choices there are. And so you have these people who were looking at the one and looking at the other, say, I'm going to take door number 3. And everyone's saying, well, there is no door number 3. And they're saying, okay, we'll invent one. And so what happened was they took what little was known about the ancient Druids, and they said, this is the kind of thing we want. We want a spirituality that's rooted in nature. We want a spirituality that celebrates the living world, the cycles of the seasons, and things like this. And yeah, they're doing this. Again, this is in the early 18th century. This is, if you like, just as a reference that many of our listeners will get, imagine characters in a Regency romance going up onto Primrose Hill in London to celebrate the autumn equinox. It happened during the Regency. There were Druids. One of these days, I want to write a Regency romance that involves, 18th century Druids. I think it'd be a hoot.
That'd be great.
There was a huge religious counterculture going on in this time that doesn't get into, your common or garden variety Regency romance, of course. But so seriously, you had these people running around who were getting into trying to create a Druid spirituality of nature. A fair number of them were Welsh or Irish or what have you. They had access to Celtic folklore, Celtic traditions, but they also had the way that the traditional religions always grow, which is you do things and you find out what works. You come up with a ritual, you perform the ritual. Does it have an effect on you? Does it seem to work, or does it just go thump? You get a kind of meditation. Somebody's teaching this kind of meditation. You say, how about I try this within the spiritual practice that I'm doing? And it goes from there. When you do that for 300 years, you've got a pretty fair body of material built up, and that's what's happened with the Druid Revival. There are a lot of things that have been worked out over that 300-year period. And so us modern Druids, we're not the Reconstructionists will tell you at the top of their lungs, we're not Reconstructionists. They're right. We're working with a tradition that it's its own thing. Right. And what we're doing is not, I'm sure it's not what the ancient Celts were doing, but they're not really around to complain at this point. And if they were around, we'd be happy to welcome them, hand them a cup of mead. So basically, when it came time to construct the curriculum of my book, The Celtic Golden Dawn, what I did was I took all this material that had been worked out in the Druid scene since the early 18th century, and all the material that had been worked out by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which draws on traditions dating back to the Renaissance, and just did a merge, if you will. And obviously that involved a lot of changes and adjustments and experimentation on my part. But I didn't have to start from scratch. I didn't have to start with some kind of vague idea, well, what could a Druid be? I already knew from within the worldview of the Druid revival what the revival traditions had worked out as, here's a curriculum, here are some things you want to learn, and you just go from there.
Well, and it's a really lovely book in that way, that
Thank you.
with the merge, what I'm, you mentioned earlier very briefly, there are some limitations to the Judeo-Christian traditional Hermetic order approach. And it seems like this beautiful merge has been able to, I would say, certainly alleviate, I don't know if you'd say eliminate, but I don't get this orientation towards ascension in it that I often kind of feel, that it's like so important to move up through degrees or whatever, in the Hermetic order, whereas this is more like, okay, we really need to, it's a very contemplative approach, which might just be a subtle difference, but I've really enjoyed it. And just, can you maybe just describe a little bit about how it's structured? Because it is like a course, really.
Oh, it is.
In a book.
It is. What I did, and this was partly kind of an overblown joke, but I put it together as though it was the collection of papers from an actual Druid Golden Dawn fusion order from the 1920s, because I thought that would be fun. And so there are 3 stages in the training. That's a very Druid thing, by the way. The Golden Dawn has a whole series of grades. But most Druid orders, if they have more than 1 degree, they have 3, because 3 is the pattern number in Celtic traditions. You have poems that give triads. You have 3 of this and 3 of that, 3 of the other thing. That's a Druid thing. So the first grade is the ovate grade. And that takes a minimum of 4 months, and that introduced the basic techniques of ritual and of meditation, the basic technique of divination that we practice, and the basics of the philosophy. It's your grounding. It's the point at which you walk through all of the ideas and you approach them just kind of as an introductory level. And then, in theory, it takes at least 4 months. Most people take between 6 months and a year, which is fine.
Yeah, I'm 6 months into ovate, and I'm like, wow, this is this is going to take me a while.
That's great.
I've skipped ahead, but I haven't practiced yet. It's like, wow. Yeah.
Everybody does. But the thing is, taking your time at the ovate level is a really good idea, because the better you learn it, the more thoroughly you work into all these various things, the better the results are going to be as you build on them. It's like putting in a foundation. You want to make sure you've got it solid. So the ovate level is the foundation level. It's the level of ideas. It's the level of basic practices. Then you go to the bardic grade. The bardic grade works mostly with what's called pathworking, which are basically self-guided visualizations, if you want to call them that. There's further dimension than that, but it's a very systematic development of the powers of the imagination. Thus the bardic reference. A bard is somebody who has a strong imagination and can tell stories. Well, that's part of what we're doing here, but we're also using the imagination as a way to tap into these symbols that you've learned in the ovate grade and the various energies. You're meditating on all this stuff. You're developing your capacity to work with, in particular, the energies and imagery and ideas of the 4 traditional elements: fire, air, water, and earth. So you really put yourself through your paces and really get a personal grasp of those elements, how they work, how they combine, and so on. And so when you finish that takes a minimum of 8 months. Again, 2 to 3 years is pretty common and totally cool. Beyond that is the Druid grade, and that's the grade at which you start doing ceremonial magic. Which now magic, people go, it's. On the one hand, you say magic, and everyone goes, "Oh, you mean devil worship?" On the other hand, you say magic, and people go, "Oh, you mean like trickery, rabbits out of hats?" No. Dion Fortune, who was a very important writer on magical topics in the early 20th century, used to describe magic as the art and science of causing change in consciousness in accordance with will.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's magic. Magic, the art and science is causing change in consciousness in accordance with will. You've got all these tools that you've picked. You've learned the basics during the Ovate grade. You've energized them and made them part of yourself in the Bardic grade. Now you can use them to help reshape your life, to help reshape the lives of other people who need your help, to help reshape the world by changing consciousness in various ways. And there are traditional ritual tools and practices that are used to do that. That's the material that you get in the Druid grade. That takes a minimum of 1 year, 3 to 5 years is pretty common.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of work.
It really
And
is. I mean, it's a good thick
and it
book.
should be.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it should be.
Yeah.
If you're getting something in 3, what you get in a weekend workshop is great for a weekend workshop, but it's not going to keep you going for years and years and years.
Mm-hmm. And then you have to practice. Mm-hmm.
Then you have to practice. So but you need. So this is trying to do. Here's a curriculum, a study. It's going to take you some years to really master all this stuff, as it would be. If you were taking up a musical instrument, you wouldn't pick up a guitar for the first time and say, "Oh, cool! I'm going to work on it this weekend, and then I'll be ready to perform." No. Or if you were going to take up dance, or let's say a martial art. Okay, you're going to spend a lot of time practicing before you're ready to go out there and actually spar with somebody.
Well, and it makes the book, I think, a really excellent investment because I could tell that right away. And I will say, I have skipped ahead and really enjoyed the Bardic grade meditations, and particularly. I use this when I'm doing trance work in sessions with clients or in workshops. Even just something as simple as focusing on an element and breathing in the energy and holding it. Not holding your breath, but
not holding your exactly. Letting the breath flow, but the element build and then discharges. And yes, that's good stuff.
And I really loved when you talked about fire as the first element and fire as the soul of the world. That was very touching, and I kind of wanted to just seed that as a little teaser for people, that it's so worth sticking through the book. Now, here's my sort of stuck point. Now, for people who've never heard of it, can you describe what geomancy is?
Oh, sure. Geomancy is simply, it's a mode of divination. Meaning it's like the tarot, it's like the I Ching, it's like any of the other methods of divination that people use. It's kind of the Western equivalent of the I Ching. It uses 16 feet. You know how the I Ching has the 64 hexagrams, right? Which, well, the geomancy has 16 tetragrams, patterns of dots, either single or double dots. There are 4 of them in a stack. There are 16 of them total. You generate them by various quasi-random processes, and you interpret them. It used to be extremely common. It was as common 500 years ago as newspaper astrology is now. Everybody knew about it. People used it all the time. It's one of the things that kind of dropped out of use when the magical traditions of the Renaissance got shoved into the dumpster in the early modern period, and it was preserved by certain magical lodges through that period. It was part of the Golden Dawn curriculum, and then I actually played a role in helping to revive it because I read Latin, and so I was able to go back and read some of the old medieval texts that give some of the really neat techniques that make it sing. It's not, like every kind of divination, it's not for everybody, but I found that for most people, it's a very effective way of divination, and it ties in very directly to the 4 elements.
Well, and you actually did write a whole book on geomancy. What's the title of that again?
That is The Art and Practice of Geomancy. And it's a whole book on the subject, and it covers not only divinatory geomancy, but the use of geomancy as a tool for meditation, as a tool for ritual, and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Right.
It's kind of my big book of geomancy.
Well, I mean, when you say played a part in the revival, I mean, yeah, it is. It's the big book of geomancy. I have definitely, I get into it and I really want to make them, and I really want to, but then I feel intimidated, I think. So I'm curious if an ovate is having trouble getting the hang of geomancy, could you substitute a different form of divination to study and still advance to the next grade? Or is there
No, you really do, because the geometric symbolism is so important to the rest of the system,
Right.
and the way it meshes into the elements and so on. You really do want to keep the thing. No, the thing is, if you're feeling intimidated, the first thing to do is relax.
Mm.
Okay, it's not a big deal. There are just 16 figures. They are your friends. You can learn how to get used to them. The important thing is relax and remember, you don't have to get into all the big book stuff. You can just cast a chart and read the judge and witnesses, the three figures at the bottom, and do your best.
Mm-hmm.
And because one of the things that I've noticed consistently with people who are studying divination is they'll get really worried about doing it wrong.
Yes.
And that's, we all grow up with schools that are fixated on you're wrong, and all this kind of nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about that. It's about very gently learning to develop your own intuitive powers. We all have those. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of how thoroughly we had to repress them to get through, whatever mess we experienced in our childhoods. Mm-hmm. And so it's just this is very much a matter of relax, don't worry. It's like the advice in my favorite book on brewing beer: relax, don't worry, have a home brew.
Okay, that's what I'll do. I'll have some of our homebrew or our homemade cider as I
exactly. Yeah. Anytime you get stressed out about geomancy, sit down, relax, have a homebrew, and then pick it up again. It's not. Don't let it intimidate you. It really is. It really is friendly. It's housebroken. Right. It likes to be scratched behind the ears.
Okay, I'll try it. Now, the next more intimidating system for me has often been the Tree of Life. I can remember the basics, and then I also feel a little like, ooh, I'm not Jewish, for instance, should I really be just dabbling in Kabbala? Mm-hmm. So the Tree of Life is a really important symbol in a lot of traditions, and each has kind of its own take on its own system of understanding. So can you offer listeners kind of I know this is totally an oxymoron, but a brief tradition of Kabbalistic tradition?
It's easy. It's easy. The Kabbala is actually incredibly simple. I do want to add one thing before we get into that, though, which is the Kabbala is not originally Jewish. I'm going to have a book in print in the near future talking about that. But Gershom Scholem, who was the greatest Jewish historian of the Kabbala, again, a major figure in the 20th century, his book on the origins of the Kabbala documents the Jews got it from the Gnostics.
Oh my goodness. Wow, you heard it first, folks. And we love the Gnostics. So this is going to be an exciting book.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. You can pick up, Gershom Scholem's book is in most university libraries. You can pick it up there. But yeah, he documents the Jew. And now the Jewish Kabbala, the Jewish Kabbala is a very rich, very powerful, very meaningful system. And any of our listeners who are Jewish, I would certainly recommend getting into it, because it really does add, my Jewish friends tell me that it really does add a very great bunch of additional depth to that already very rich tradition. So that's, but it's its own thing. The thing is, it was brought in from Gnostic sources into the Jewish tradition in the 11th century. It's actually, relatively recently. And then within 2 centuries of that, there were versions of it going into other traditions around the Western world. And so it's actually been it is, in fact, one of the things that really keyed me into the fact that something is going on here is that there is a Chinese version of the Tree of Life that shows up almost 100 years before the first known Jewish version of it in China.
Goodness. Wow, this is fascinating.
So, if you go back far enough, you find it rooted in the ancient Greek mysticism. Because the Gnostics were developing on a lot of stuff that the Orphics and the Pythagoreans and various other people, Neoplatonists, have gotten into. So there's this very rich tradition that comes to us in the West largely through this connection with the Jewish tradition, and it's a perfectly valid connection. But the Tree of Life is older than that. The Tree of
Yeah.
Life the Tree of Life shows up. There are references to it in writings dating from the second and third centuries.
You're blowing my mind here. This is
Oh, yeah, I do that. This is why I talk about I'm a geek. I spend a lot of time reading old strange books, and sometimes I come up with something useful. So but the basic idea of the Kabbala, the basic idea of the Tree of Life, let's say, is that the universe has a sort of tenfold pattern. There are these 10 stages in every creative process, and this is as true when you make a sandwich as it is when the universe comes into being. Every process of creation unfolds through these 10 stages that move back and forth from balance to energy to form, and so on and so forth. If you've got an image of the Tree of Life available, or if any of our listeners do, all the things on the right side, what's called sometimes the pillar of force, that's the energy. Everything on the left side, the three spheres in that line, that's the pillar of form, and the pillar of balance goes down the middle. So whenever you're working with the Tree of Life, you're working with this basic creative pattern that we actually all know anyway. It's just a matter of getting past, again, the intimidation factor. And so the Kabbala, the Tree of Life, has gradually evolved as a way of thinking about the universe. It's, everything fits into these 10 slots in a certain sense. And so it's a way of thinking about the universe, a way of putting together our experience in a meaningful fashion, a fashion that makes sense to us, that allows us to understand things, and that allows us to cause change in consciousness in accordance with will. That becomes the magical Kabbala. So we have all of these symbols that relate to each of the 10 spheres of the tree. And we have various symbols that relate to the 22 paths, or connecting lines, if you will, that link together the spheres in a particular way. And you can shape your consciousness in different directions. You can, focus on this or focus on that. When you need to tap into a very nurturing energy, you can do that. If you need to tap into a warrior energy, you can do that. All of these things are there.
Where do you start? Like, where do you start in the 10? And can you just sort of describe the pit stops?
Sure.
10
well, we all start at the bottom, like everything else. Okay, the universe starts at the top. We start at the bottom. The 10th sphere, the Hebrew name for it is Malkut. The name that I use in the Celtic Golden Dawn, the Welsh term, is Nav. That means the shaper. There are 10 traditional titles of deity that show up in some of the old Welsh material, and so I assign them to the Tree of Life. The same way that the people who created the Jewish Kabbalah assigned 10 traditional concepts of divinity to the Jewish Tree of Life. So Nav, the shaper, that's the world as we experience it most of it, just as a our rest level. The world as a bunch of material objects. Okay, here's the phone, here's the table. Here's the book, here's the internet computer sitting there, and so here are these things. It's a world of things. It's the world that we experience when we don't clear our minds a little bit and try to look past that surface. Okay, that's the outcome of the whole creative process. And it's by getting back behind that, we start tapping into the creative process so we can start using it. Okay, the next level up, the 9th sphere, Yesod in Hebrew, Ner in Welsh. Ner means the mighty. Okay, that is the sphere of patterns of influence and energy. Think of it as power. Think of it as pressure.
Okay,
that's all the flows. It in our system, it corresponds to the element of water, because it's very much about flow. It's about the things, that's where you don't think of it as a table. You realize that this is part of a trajectory through time that started out as a tree and it's going to end up as soil. Okay, and everything becomes fluid and flowing, and you start realizing that maybe things aren't quite as rigid as they look.
Right.
Okay. Then we go to the 8th sphere. This is over. Now, these first two were on the middle pillar, the pillar of balance. Okay. Now we're going over to the side of form.
Okay.
And here we have Bith in Welsh, Hod in Hebrew. This is the sphere of perception, of the basic functionings of the mind, of the way our minds sort of sift everything out into little glimpses and elements of sensation. You look at the table in front of you, let's say, and all of a sudden you realize you're putting together this table out of things that your eyes tell you, and things that your hand tells you, and things that your ears tell you when the cat jumps onto it, and all kinds of things like that, So things start becoming glimpses, and again, there's modes of flexibility there. That's the place where the mind, in terms of the mind, becomes playful in Beef, and it stops taking itself quite so seriously.
Okay.
We go to the other side. Yeah, we go to the other side. The seventh sphere is Biu. And the Hebrew term is nefach. And that's the sphere of emotion. That's where the passions are. That's where the nurturing energy is. That's where the life force takes shape in living things. First takes shape in living things. It ties into the passions and the emotions, and we, by understanding that, we come to understand that as a mode of experience and a mode of knowing about the world. Our society is very constipated about emotions. Still, I mean, after you think the '60s would have cured us of that, but not so much. And getting to the point where we don't take them, we don't ignore them, and we don't wallow in them. We experience them, we understand them, we help, we balance them against the rest of our lives, and so on. Okay, above now, those four levels are levels that everybody actually interacts with all the time, even though we don't always notice it.
Okay.
We always experience that the nav level of things as things. Things as just stuff, physical objects, things sitting there. We all experience the flows. We all experience sensation. We all experience emotion. This is all part of the world as we regularly experience it, although we don't necessarily pay attention to that. Above that is what's called the veil, and that's the first of two barriers across the tree. And now, they're barriers that can be passed through, but it takes some work in both cases. So the veil is what separates our normal mental functioning from the functioning of our minds and our souls that we can achieve through spiritual practice. And so the first one of there are three spheres directly above that. We've got the four lower, we've got the three that are the next rung up, and the first of those is Miner. That's Tifereth in Hebrew, and that is the sphere of the life force. The life force, not bound in living things, but flowing through all things. You all know this one. The forces of you know Obi-Wan's line, it's an energy field that binds the galaxy together, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
George Lucas was ripping stuff off from every spiritual tradition in the world when he quoted that. So if you want to think of the force, yes, the force.
That's a good one. That was very good.
Exactly. The thing is, everybody these days, you just have to say, use the force, Luke, and everyone knows what you're talking about. But Miner, that sixth sphere, Tifereth in Hebrew, that is the center of the life force, as Druids see it. That's where it becomes free. That's where you can tap into that, those flows and patterns and powers. And that's why you have to raise your state of consciousness through the veil, so you can tap into that. That's why we don't normally perceive the world that way. That's why we do spiritual practices. Above that, we're going over to the sphere, over to the side of form again. Above that, we have Moder, which is that's Gebura in Hebrew. That's a tough one for a lot of people because that's the hard energies of life. That's where we're dealing with suffering.
Okay.
And we're dealing with anger. We're dealing with the difficult stuff. And that's where we come to realize, how the universe is put together and where the limits are and why they matter and why they're actually good things to have. A lot of people in pop spirituality these days get all bent out about, oh my God, limits. Believing in limits is a really awful thing. Well, I'm really glad right now that my chair is limiting me. It's limiting my butt from bouncing off the floor. Okay. And the floor is limiting me from falling through it. Limits can be overdone, but in their place, they're really useful. Okay. A lot of people these days have a real problem with boundaries. That's another word for limits. And so Moder is the sphere. The fifth sphere is the sphere where we learn how to set boundaries and how to maintain them. And that's one of the things psychologically we tap into that, and that's where power manifests. Okay. Then we go over to the other side, to the side of force, and there we have Ener. That's Chesed in Hebrew, And that is the sphere of expansion and mercy,
Hmm.
okay? Where Moder is the hard aspects of life. Ener is the easy aspects, is the flowing aspects, the gentle aspects. You hold those, of course you hold those in balance. And those two come together in balance in the force, in Miner. And so now beyond that, beyond those three, we have another barrier, and this is rather more complex. This is called the abyss. And what we're talking about here is the gap between the created world, the world as we're capable of experiencing, and the transcendent realities that are always present to us, are always present with us, but that we can never really directly take into ourselves while we're still ourselves. And it's just, it's a limit. It's a necessary and appropriate limit, but we can interact with those realities. And those realities are really you kind of have to start using mythological language here, because the third sphere, Doveth, that's Bina in Hebrew, is the Great Mother. Think of all your mother goddesses in mythology. That's the power we're talking about, the primeval, primordial, maternal energy that gives form to all things. Balancing that over on the pillar of force, we have Perith, which is the Great Father, the paternal energy, that which sends forth, that which stirs into being. Those two in balance. And then above them all is Keli, this Keter in Hebrew, which is the universe in its ultimate essence, which we can never directly experience. It's always there. It's always with us. The Sufis like to say it's as closer to us than our jugular veins, but we can never really experience it. We can never know it. It's just there all the time. And about that, absolutely nothing can be said without turning it into nonsense, because human language won't grasp at that level. So that's your basic walk through the tree of life. And all of these are things we either experience or have to deal with all the time. It's not that complex. It's not strange alien tentacle, what have you. It's a way of talking about the universe we all live in. And it just simplifies things a bit and sorts them out and shows how you can move from one state of consciousness to another, so you can interact with these things in a way that supports what you're trying to do.
Well, I've really appreciated how you've sorted it out for me. Maybe it's
Well, thank you.
that I'm partly, in some ways, like an auditory learner or something, because this is just, it feels very clear, and I can see in my mind where we were moving through the map. I'm curious if are there any then significant differences between the traditional, let's say the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition that we know of, and the Druidical approach to how, for instance, how you're using the Tree of Life in the Celtic Golden Dawn, your book? Is it very different from what people would pick up in another book on Kabbala?
Well, the symbolism is different, obviously. When I'm talking Kabbala, I'm using examples out of daily life, which a lot of other books don't, and partly I'm using the particular perspective you'll get from within the Druidical tradition. But the basic ideas are the same. If you pick up a Golden Dawn book, one that I really recommend, Lon Milo Duquette's book, The Chicken Kabbala.
The Chicken Kabbala.
The Chicken Kabbala. It's short. It's extremely funny. Lon calls himself the world's only stand-up Kabbalist, and he's right. He's one of the funniest men I've ever heard, and he's a really brilliant Kabbalistic teacher. So that book has become kind of an introduction that everybody uses.
Good. Okay.
I am actually working on a sequel to the Celtic Golden Dawn. Working title is the Celtic Kabbala, which is going to go through all of this in much more detail.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah,
Little teaser there for people. I love it.
It's taken some time, because one of the things I always do when I'm writing a book on magic, I will not publish it until I have done every single exercise in the book. Often enough that I've worked out all the bugs, I know where the problems are, and have put in stuff to fix them and so on. That's just that strikes me as basic courtesy to my readers. If somebody's willing to plop them, pay money for a book of mine, I want to give them something that I've tested.
Oh, thank you. No, and
welcome.
I've tested them also. I've road tested in a number of your books.
Thank you.
Certainly, even just pulled phrases out of some of the books that are not so much handbooks, like The Long Descent. I've used that in retreats. Certainly Mystery
Mystery
Teachings of
teachings.
the Living Earth. I use that a lot.
Yeah.
So the Celtic Golden Dawn has definitely gone into my toolkit as well. I'm
glad to hear that.
You talked about the fifth sphere, Moder, I think you called it. And I wonder if this is where grief comes in as well.
Grief, basically, we all we all have experiences in life that we don't like. We all have experiences that hurt. Pain is is reality. It's not an illusion, despite what some people in pop spirituality say. It happens. It's a reality. And so grief is one of the things that comes out of that sphere.
Okay. Now you had said, so this is the sphere of suffering, and you particularly pointed out anger. And I'm curious how you personally, John, manage your feelings of anger or rage, particularly when you kind of look out at the world as it is. You've been writing about peak oil as well as magical things for so long. And there must be some anger there or rage about the world. I mean, just it's infuriating sometimes. It must be so frustrating. I'm curious what does that look like, on an average Thursday or, Monday morning rage? How do you deal with it?
Well, to some extent, there are a couple of levels here. On the one hand, there are aspects of that tend to want to go down into the body. We're social primates. We still got all those linkages that teach us to, rev up for a fight. I've done a lot of stuff in the martial arts, and I highly recommend that as a way to deal constructively with anger, with rage, with all those emotions. Because, on the one hand, there's something profoundly satisfying about punching a piece of lumber and having it shatter. And this is particularly something I recommend to women, because women have been taught to be passive. They've been lied to, let's be blunt, that they don't have power, they don't have strength, they can't shatter boards. And that's why I honestly think that we would be a much saner society if in place of girls' PE in the schools, we had martial arts training. And every girl who is physically able to, of course, other arrangements made for those who have various physical disadvantages, but those who are physically able to should learn how to break boards with their bare hands, and just to own that power that we all have, whatever our gender happens to be. But that's a good physically. That's a very good thing. The thing is, anger. When you get angry at the world for not being what you want, very often, this is hard to say. Very often there is an underlying sense of entitlement, a sense that the world ought to be listening to you, and it really helps to spend some time in meditation, really dealing with the fact that the universe doesn't. The sky is not watching you. And so. What you do matters to you. It matters to the people who know you. It matters to people who are influenced by you. But the universe is not going to listen. And so if you can work your way into that space, anger becomes just much less of an issue, because, the universe is not particularly going to do what you want to. And then instead of getting angry, you take that emotional energy and you direct it into doing something constructive. And that's, in my mind, really the thing. When I get really bent out of shape or something, I write a lot. That's one of my major modes of creative work. And so I will sit down and write a blistering essay about something that something badly needs blistering, or what have you. Or just don't let the energy fester. Don't let it sit and simmer and make you miserable. I don't know. Your mileage may vary. What works for me is taking the energy and doing something with it, pouring it into something, so that it doesn't just sit and fester and make me unhappy.
Well, if anybody would like to enjoy the blistering essays, you can find them on ecosophia.net. I have enjoyed them, but I will say that actually the Celtic Golden Dawn was a different flavor for me. It was there is a gentleness to it that I really appreciated, and a patience, and it really does feel like a collection of letters from mentor to from adept to initiate. It was a lovely conversation.
I'm delighted to hear that came across, because that was something I was really trying to achieve in that.
Good. Well, thank you so much for sharing this information on that book, and I'm going to put links in the show notes, but I really appreciate all the teaching you did today, John.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
I would like to break boards with my hands. Yes, I am interested in this suggestion. Not only did I learn some things, I got some ideas today. Did you learn some things, folks? Hello, the Kabbala is older than the Jewish tradition. The tree of life is older than the Jewish tradition. My goodness. Yeah, I really think the way that John described the tree of life is going to sit with me a bit longer than it ever has through books. It's nice when it's told to you in story form like that. To read some of John's always excellent and sometimes blistering essays, remember, go to his website, ecosophia.net, ECOSOPHIA.net. I'd like to thank all my listeners in the Jewish diaspora for proliferating and stewarding the beauty and the knowledge of the tree of life all these centuries. Thank you very much, those of you who are listening. And finally, just a heads up that deposits are due April 1st to come on quest with me during the full moon in June 2018. You can now place your deposit online. You can learn all the details on my website under the Retreats tab at carmenspanyola.com, CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.